Story 1. I think it was around 16. It is always odd when I see very young kids with phones or tablets. I did not get my own laptop until I started college, and I had to buy it myself. Story 2. I got my first phone when I was 12. It was a basic flip phone without any smart features. Story 3. It was 1999. I was 14 at the time. It was a real dumb phone from that era. I barely used it because none of my friends had phones, there was no internet back then, and you had to pay for each short message service message and for every minute of talk. Unlimited plans were a joke. Story 4. I was about 7 years old when I found it in a drawer and decided it was mine. Laughing out loud. Story 5. I was 16 when I started driving in 1998. The phone was for emergencies only, 30 minutes a month, and each text also counted as 1 minute. Story 6. They finally became affordable and had decent coverage. Story 7. 18. People had not seen cell phones back then, and I guess no one in the town had the model I had. Glorious days. Story 8. I bought one when I got my first real job at age 18. People laughed at me, saying, "Why would you need a phone outside your house? Who would even call you?" I could only afford 15 minutes of talk time each month, and texting had not yet been invented, so I really looked like an idiot for having it. Story 9. When I was 16, I got my first job and could pay for it myself. Story 10. I was 22 because cell phones were brand spanking new. That was the only time I got a cell phone. Story 11. I was 14, a freshman in high school. I have had the same number ever since, for more than half my life. Story 12. I didn't get a phone until I was 14, which felt late compared to some friends. When I finally got it, I remember obsessively learning all the features and spending hours texting and exploring. Felt like a massive upgrade in freedom. Story 13. I was 15, and I had a flip phone. Smartphones did not exist yet. My parents told me that if I wanted my own phone, I had to get a job. I got a job, and then they became upset. Story 14. When I was 18, I paid for the plan with Singular myself. It cost $20 per month and was one of those old Nokia bricks. Story 15. In the year 2000, when I was 18 years old, I had a Qualcomm Kyocera Model 2760. I loved that phone and its ringtone, which you can hear on another phone. I lived with my older brother and his wife, and I had to register 2 additional phones under my name because their credit was too poor. Story 16. I was 13 when I got it because I started high school. Otherwise, I would have gotten it at an older age. Story 17. It was a Nokia 5160 time division multiple access model. I don't remember when it came out. Story 18. I had a flip phone with no camera, no internet, and no games. Could make calls, but texting cost 10 cents per text and it took too long to type anything. For amusement, I would change the stock images on people's saved contacts. Nowadays, I prefer texting to calling. Story 19. I was 21, around 2009. I enjoyed being unreachable. I paid $12 per month for a landline in my apartment and had an answering machine. I finally got with the times when my best friend said she would add me to her and her brother's phone plan for $25 per month because I had moved in with them and they were tired of not being able to reach me. I missed the days when I did not have one. Story 20. Late in the year 2000, I was already in my long-term career, but cell phones had finally become reasonably priced for limited purposes. Story 21. The high-tech computer corporation dream in 2008. I would have been 25 at the time. Edit. Laughing out loud. I was mistaken, it was a non-smartphone, the Nokia 6820 from 2003. Story 22. I was 18 when I went off to college. It was a Nokia 5190, which I think was one of the variant models. Story 23. I was around 23 or 24 years old. Carriers charged per character for text messages for a long time, which is where much of the shorthand originated. Story 24. I got my first phone in 1997 or 1998 when I was in high school. Story 25. I had to wait until I was 37 for them to invent it. My first cell phone was installed in a car with a telephone-style handset. Story 26. It was the size of a brick and had its own bag. I used it sparingly because it cost $5 per minute. Yes, I am old as dirt. How did you know? Story 27. I think I was 10. I was left home alone a lot, so it was kind of necessary. Edit. I posted the wrong age. Story 28. I ended up on a different highway and had to walk a mile to a payphone and borrow money from strangers. After that, my parents got me a cell phone. Story 29. It was an old Siemens brick with an analog display that my sister and I shared so either of us could call when we went to the playground alone. Story 30. I was 12 and in 6th grade when I received a Kyocera Rise from Virgin Mobile as a Christmas present. It was an excellent phone. The slider keyboard felt smooth and comfortable. Story 31. I'm about 35 years old. I remember the days of wired landline phones, spiral wound headset cords, and the blissful ignorance of not having the entirety of human knowledge and human stupidity at my fingertips. Story 32. I was 19 and it was a bag phone. I thought I was hot shit carrying it around. Story 33. I was 8, but that was back in 2003, and I was left home alone quite often. Story 34. I think I was 45. Yes, I am old as hell. I got along well enough as a kid with a quarter in my pocket. Then everyone insisted on a cell phone number. I went from a flip phone to a basic smartphone. I still get the most basic model. Story 35. At 13, I walked more than a kilometer to the bus stop and took the city bus by myself for the first time after moving from a town that was barely a district to a small city. Story 36. I think I was about 22 or 23 when I graduated and first started working. My first phone was a Nokia 6110. Story 37. When I was about 15, I remember my Motorola slider phone. It was built like a brick, and that was not even the most durable phone at the time. Story 38. I think it was when I got my first real job after finishing college, so 23. Story 39. I was one of the very last people I knew to get a mobile phone. I was over 50. I still rarely use it. I guess I am just over the hill. Story 40. I was 19 years old. This was in 1998, so it was just a flip phone. Story 41. I was 15 or 16. My younger brother got one before my older brother and me. I have had about 10 phones since then. 1 Nokia, 1 HTC, 2 Samsung, and 6 Sony. Story 42. I was about 13 between 8th and 9th grade, around 2003. I was a latchkey kid. Story 43. In 1999, I was 18 years old. My mom bought me a bag phone because it was supposed to have better service for the stretch of country road I drove to my boyfriend's house, which was 45 minutes away. I felt like I was calling in airstrikes whenever I used it. Story 44. I was 12 or 13 years old, in 6th grade, and had a flip phone. I absolutely loved that phone. It was convenient, small, and I enjoyed pressing so many actual buttons. Story 45. I was 13 in 2001 when I had a job at the local library that allowed me to buy things for myself. My first cell phone was a Nokia track phone that was very expensive, about $8 for 10 minutes, but I eventually got a Samsung N105 on a prepaid T-Mobile plan. I remember learning that you could use America Online Instant Messenger via text message. In 8th grade, that was life-changing, using America Online Instant Messenger without having to be at the computer. It was a very different time. Story 46. I was about 10 or 11 using the Nokia 1100 series. I still have it somewhere. I am typing this from my Galaxy S25 right now, laughing out loud. Story 47. The first time I used one was for a company I worked for when I was 22. They had a vehicle installed unit and a portable Motorola Dynamic Adaptive Total Area Coverage unit. I got my first personal phone when I was 25. Story 48. Does a Motorola bag phone count? If so, I was about 26 years old in 1988. Story 49. I was about 7 or 8 because my mom worked 14-hour shifts 6 days a week as a single mother. I was home alone a lot or with my grandmother when possible, which felt safer. Story 50. This was in the days before smartphones. My age was not a coincidence. If I was going to be driving, My parents wanted me to have a cell phone with me in case of emergency. For many years, that was all I used it for. It was powered off in my car and kept there only in case I had an accident. Story 51. I was 18 and got a Nokia 6190. It had the game Snake and a battery that lasted 2 weeks. Story 52. If I remember correctly, I was 8 or 9 years old. It was a Nokia. Story 53. I am 44. I got one when I was 17 in 1999 because my father gave me a prepaid phone to call him. My parents were divorced and I did not get to see him that much, so he wanted to make sure I could talk to him. Story 54. The compact Senio 4000 is a durable unit with a battery that lasted a week. Story 55. To be fair, I was the youngest of 3. My oldest brother was 15 and my other brother was 12, so my parents felt bad and got me one. Story 56. It was the year 2000. I was 28 and someone gave me their Philips phone. Story 57. In the late 1980s, I had a car phone installed. The service cost $45 a month and included no minutes. Minutes cost 65 cents each from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and 45 cents a minute at night. Story 58. I got a cell phone my second year of college. Late 90s. I used a pager before that. Story 59. I think I was 14 or 15, and it was a flip phone. I am very grateful that I grew up without the level of technology we have today. I have a hard enough time responsibly managing time on my phone as an adult. I cannot imagine how addicted I would have been in my formative years. Story 60. Around 30? They were called car phones then and looked like a brick. Story 61. I got a phone when I was about 6. It was a flip phone. I did not do much with it besides having my mother call me when dinner was ready. Story 62. When I was 9, my parents got divorced. A few months later, one parent got a new phone, and the phone upgrades were passed to my 2 older siblings. I ended up with a BlackBerry with the world's smallest full keyboard that slid out so I could communicate with the other parent because of split weekday custody. It had 5 levels of the colored bubble pop game, so I was happy. Story 63. I bought my first phone when I was 19, after I moved out of my dad's house and did not have a landline in the place I was renting. I think it was an $80 Samsung flip phone. It worked great. I missed T9 predictive text because I could send full messages without even looking at the screen. Story 64. In early high school around 2004, I had an Alcatel phone, if I recall correctly, and later used some of the early Nokia 30 series phones. Story 65. I think I was about 19 in 1999. It was a very basic candy bar phone that did not even have a clock. Story 66. When I was 12, I was so excited to play a helicopter game on a green, pixelated flip phone. Story 67. I got one when I was in 6th grade. It was back when cell phones were fairly new and had no games other than Snake. I mostly used it so I did not have to use pay phones to call when I wanted to be picked up from school for after-school activities or practice. Story 68. I did not get my current smartphone until I was 36 or 37. Story 69. 27. Motorola Flip. It was very expensive per minute for calls and text messages. Story 70. Around 20. It was quite strange in public as very few people had mobile phones at that time. Story 71. I got the brick back in the 1980s when I was about 30. Story 72. I was 28. Granted, they were not really a thing before, except maybe the chief executive officers with brick cell phones and later BlackBerry devices. Story 73. In 2005, I was 18 and got a job as a summer camp counselor in a resort town. I finally decided it was worth it. Story 74. I had to wait until I was old enough to get my own contract because my father would not add me to his. Story 75. I had a cheap flip phone when I was around 17, mostly for emergencies. This was before smartphones. Story 76. I was 15 and a half years old. I had a very cheap phone because my parents were not well off then. It was a Samsung Core Ace 2X. It worked until it began freezing constantly and eventually struck a wall at high speed. Teenage angst, I suppose. Story 77. Motorola StarTAC Elite. It cost me $900, and service was $25 per month and 25 cents per minute. The battery lasted 8 hours, and I also had a larger 13-hour battery. The day I bought it, my dog pulled it out of my briefcase and chewed the antenna. My brand new $900 phone. She wagged her tail and ate it. I almost cried. Story 78. I had a Go phone when I was 11 that could only send texts or make calls. My dad gave me 30 messages per month. I got my first smartphone at 13. Story 79. I was about 14. The reason was that I used to ride bicycle motocross and would break bones at least once each summer. My mom got tired of getting calls from the hospital, so she gave me a phone strictly for calling her in case of emergencies. It was a Nokia 3310 or something like that. Story 80. I was pregnant, and my husband wanted me to be able to contact him if I needed to. Story 81. I was 20 when I got a basic flip phone with no internet and no games. Story 82. I can't remember. Probably around 10 to 12, but my sense of time is poor, so that might be wrong. Story 83. My first cell phone arrived when I was 15. It was mainly for emergencies, but it opened up a whole new world. Story 84. I was in 8th grade, so I was around 13. It was a standard Nokia blue brick phone. I think I still have it somewhere, laughing out loud. Story 85. 13. At the time, the common idea was that you would not need a phone in primary school, but it would be a good idea in high school. High school started at age 13, although it was lowered to 12 while I was there. Phones were cheap and could hardly do anything other than make calls or send text messages, but you did not need much else. I got a Samsung S2 when I was 14. It was a couple of years old at the time, I think. Story 86. When my daughter started going to preschool, I wanted them to be able to contact me if she became ill. Story 87. My first phone was when I was 12. It was an old iPhone 5S that functioned like a flip phone, but I could use the Notes application and take pictures. I had moved and walked to school, so I needed it to stay in contact with my mother and let her know where I was. I got a proper phone when I was 15 in high school after the 5S stopped working. Story 88. During my sophomore year, I got one of those Firefly-type phones with 4 pre-programmed numbers. It was embarrassing. Near the end of my junior year, I got a chocolate phone. Story 89. My mother purchased one of those old brick Nokia phones without realizing she was locking herself into a multi-year contract. This was back in the early 2000s. I offered to take over the contract for her. Story 90. When I was about 11, I had a phone I could only use to call my parents, grandparents, and cousins, and it did not have internet access. Story 91. I was 15 when I started staying after school regularly for extracurricular activities. I had a severely limited number of texts per month and no data. I had a slide phone. Story 92. I got an iPhone 6S when I was 19. I am currently 22, and it was the best experience back in 2022. Story 93. I believe I was 11 or 12. My mother became caught up in the paranoia after the attacks of September 11, 2001. Story 94. I was around 28 or 29. I had a pager. I got married before I had a cell phone. Story 95. I was 39 or 40, around 2002 to 2003, and I switched at the insistence of my partner at the time. Prior to that, I used a landline for more than 2 decades of cross-country drives and moves. It was a Qualcomm candy bar phone, which I still have in a drawer somewhere, along with a Nokia, a Razr, a BlackBerry, 2 early iPhone models, and so on. Meanwhile, among all those bricks, my 1963 rotary phone worked just fine until Pulse service stopped being supported in my area a few years ago. Story 96. I am 19 now, so I did not get my own phone until I got a job 2 years ago. Story 97. We shared it. My husband when he traveled for work, my daughters when they had to work late, and I when no one else did. Story 98. I was 59 and got it as an owner-operator trucker. Cell phones came from the complaint I kept hearing. All the money we are wasting in the space program. Story 99. I was 30 when the first big cell phone came out in the early 1990s. Story 100. I got my first tablet when I was 8. I got my first mobile phone when I was 13. It was a used phone. I got my first new phone when I was 15. I am 18 now. Story 101. I was probably 17 or 18. The phone was the size of my pointer finger, and the screen flipped open. I remember that to text you had to tap the number button with the letters beneath it a certain number of times to get the correct letter. There was no internet. Texting cost extra. There were free minutes after 9. Story 102. I got my first cell phone at 28. It sat in a bag tucked under the car seat until I needed it. I plugged it into the cigarette lighter to power it. Even though it used cellular technology, we called it a car phone because that was the only place you could use it. Story 103. At the age of 15, I got my first personal phone. It was a Nokia N78. What a dreamy phone. Story 104. In 1999, I was in 8th grade, so I was about 13 years old. It was an old Nokia phone. If I still had it, it would probably still work. Laughing out loud. Story 105. I think I was about 14 or 15 and had a huge track phone with an over 12-inch extendable antenna. I remember calling my mother from the mall to pick me up, and a group of girls laughed at me, saying, "He thinks he's talking to someone." Oh, the memories. Story 106. I was around 20, and it was one of those brick-like Nokia 3310 phones. Story 107. I was 15 in 2000, which would have made me a fairly early adopter, except 1. My parents wanted me to have a communication device. They paid for it and constantly made sure I had it. 2. I grew up in Silicon Valley, so it definitely did not make me the cool kid. I was just there with all the Joneses at school, laughing out loud. Sexting is by no means new, and I miss physical buttons so I could no-look text. No surprise, my peers and I learned to reliably text someone just by feel while pretending to pay attention. Story 108. Picture this. 1996. I had a bag phone when I was 16 that charged by the minute and was for emergency use only. Story 109. When I was in the 4th grade, back in 1998 to 1999, I had to walk home instead of taking the bus. My parents wanted me to call them or my grandparents if I needed a ride or if something happened while I was walking alone, and to call them when I got home so they knew I was safe. Story 110. That was more than 35 years ago. I have hated it since day one and still do. We are slaves to our phones. It has virtually destroyed 2 generations of young people worldwide. Shame. Story 111. Back in the late 1990s, I was about 20. A cell phone sales representative came into the low-paid hourly job I had and offered us free phones on the company's dime. We didn't care. I think they were Sony Ericsson models. It was cool to have them for a little while before we had to give them back. Story 112. I got my first phone at 16. It was nothing fancy, but I felt like I had just unlocked adulthood. Story 113. I was 15 when I got my first phone. It was a Nokia 3310, and it was practically indestructible. I'm pretty sure I got it after my freshman year of high school because my mom got a good deal adding a line to her plan, and I inherited the phone and its number. I kept that number into my 30s. Story 114. I believe I was 11 or 12. I had one of those phones that slid up and revealed a keyboard. It was pretty cool and inexpensive. I could text and call. At the time, that was all I needed. Story 115. When I was 16, I had a pay-as-you-go phone. I was the first person in my family to have a cell phone. Story 116. I got my first flip phone when I was 9. It was a cheap prepaid phone because I had begged for many years for a cell phone. I received it for Christmas. Story 117. I am a baby boomer. I was 51 when I first got a cell phone. It was 3 days after September 11th, 2001. When the planes hit the towers, I was several states away from home. I drove for a day and a half to return, unable to stay in touch with anyone because I had been putting off getting a cell phone. I got a Sprint phone as soon as I arrived home. Story 118. I was 17 in 2010, and it remains my favorite phone. Story 119. I was 28 or 29. It was the late 1990s. I had a pager at first while my wife was pregnant and we lived in a remote location with terrible coverage. It was that or a bag phone. The pager was free and the bag phone was not. 3 months after the birth, we moved to a larger city with coverage and I got a handheld cell phone. Story 120. At 18, I hated not having one, but after seeing how many people who got unrestricted internet access at a young age turned out, I'm so glad I was forced to wait. Story 121. I saved up my own birthday, Christmas, and money from odd jobs. I went into the shop with my friend and chose it myself. I was so proud. It was a brick, but it was my brick. Story 122. I was 8 because my parents were divorced and refused to speak to each other. Story 123. It was my 15th birthday when I first got my own cell phone. If it were not for my Reddit streak and webtoon, I probably would not touch my phone at all. Story 124. I was 14. I got a Samsung Juke. I still miss that phone. I do not miss T9 predictive text, though. Story 125. I got a Nokia TracFone prepaid at about age 25. I cannot remember exactly, but at that time people made fun of prepaid phones, and later they became common. Story 126. I think I was 12. It was a slide-up TracFone so I could call my parents after practices, laughing out loud. Story 127. I got my first smartphone at 14 when I started high school. Story 128. I was 14. It was a $50 Android from Walmart. I did not get an iPhone until I was 17. My older sister got an iPhone at 12 and my younger sister got one at 9. It was my older sister's hand-me-down, but still typical middle child stuff. Now I am almost 22 and have an iPhone 16 Pro that I paid for. Story 129. I got a phone without cellular data in 5th grade. I got cellular data in 7th grade. Story 130. I was 18, and it was a TracFone from Walmart. It had no camera and no internet, and I had to pay per character to send text messages. It was terrible, but it was all I could afford, and I was moving out of state and away from family, so I needed something. Story 131. I think I was about 30. We had pay phones when I was growing up. I went to Europe at 15 years old to play concerts with the American Youth Symphony and Choir. We went with no phones, and I called home collect twice during a 3-week period. One time we were in Germany, and very few Germans knew English back then. One of the guys I knew had taken German in school, so he spoke with the German operator to get us an international line to the United States. Story 132. I was around 12 or 13, I think. That was about 20 years ago. Wow, time has gone by so fast. Story 133. I was 10, and it was a flip phone. The only reason my sister and I got phones was that we started attending sleepaway camp. Story 134. It was a basic flip phone with an antenna, but it had a camera, which was cool. Story 135. I was about 16 during the holiday when I graduated from junior high because I was leaving home to attend high school. Story 136. I was 15, but only because I had moved into my high school dorms more than an hour from home. That was back in the T9 predictive text days, when messages had a 160-character limit and we were told to call only after 7 p.m. because minutes were cheaper. My phone was not a brick. It was a small navy blue Nokia. Story 137. When I was an embryo, I had one in my mom's womb. I am not sure how it got there. It was between the Italians. Real greaseball shit. Story 138. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, laughing out loud, I had a brick-sized phone. It was so inconvenient and its battery was nearly dead after one call, so I switched to a car phone. My daughter was 12 and a texting maniac. I gave one to my son when he was 10, but he was not interested and it stayed in his school bag. They would sit on the couch and text each other. Story 139. I got a flip phone at 18 because I was driving to and from college a lot, and the weather here can get nasty in winter. Smartphones were still new back then. It was wise to have a phone in case I was out between towns. Story 140. Probably 5 or 6. A buddy up the road is asking if I want to hang out. Story 141. I was 11. It was an old Motorola brick back in 1999 and 2000. Story 142. If you mean mobile phone, I was 17. Nokia 3330. From before the age of smartphones. For your information, the term mobile phone is associated with British English and is commonly used in Commonwealth countries. 70% of the world call them mobile phones and 30% call them cell phones. Story 143. I searched for my first phone, the Philips C12. I would have been 26 when it came out. Story 144. I was around 16 in 2003. I had to get a job and save up to be able to afford the phone and the service plan myself. Story 145. One of the early Nokia brick phones with a pull-out antenna. Story 146. From 2002 to 2003, I was in middle school in a town of about 14,000 people. I got my first smartphone in high school. It was a brick phone with an extendable antenna. The phone supported both analog cellular service and first-generation code division multiple access. Story 147. I was about 12 or 13 when I first had access to a phone, but my brother, sister, and I had to share it. Later, it was just my brother and me while my sister got her own. I did not have one all to myself until high school, which was also my first smartphone, since the earlier shared devices were not smartphones. Story 148. I must have been about 17 or 18, and to be completely honest, it was not even my phone. I was working at a cinema and found it while cleaning a theater. This was in the early 2000s, so it was a flip phone. Passcodes were not common then, and it was not on a service plan. It just had a certain number of minutes remaining. I decided to keep it, found a compatible charger, and those minutes lasted me quite a while. Story 149. In 2006, when I was 7, it was a Nokia phone with an orange monochrome display. About 2 years later, I received an old Samsung flip phone from my grandmother. It had a fun snowball game on it, and I cannot find it anymore. Story 150. Around 9 or 10, my sister and I started sharing a flip phone because we stayed home alone while our parents were at work. They wanted to be able to check on us because they could not afford a babysitter, and we were old enough to look after ourselves. If we had not been home alone, we probably would not have gotten phones until high school. Story 151. I was about 18. My parents said I could have one when I could pay for it myself, laughing out loud. Story 152. I received a phone when I was 13. It had been used by my uncle and was passed down to me. It did not stay charged for long. Later, it was replaced by my mother's new phone. Story 153. The first vehicle cell phone was a handset you detached from the car and carried for about 30 minutes, which was the maximum battery life. I was 19 and felt very cool. I do not want to talk about the cost of phone calls. Story 154. I was 14. No one in my friend group had a phone, so I could not text with them. We could only make calls. Story 155. My first mobile phone was a Nokia, which I received on my 13th birthday. Story 156. When I was 13, I only used it for calls because I had no interest in anything else and spent most of my time playing outside on the farm. Story 157. When I was 13, my parents decided they would not pay my phone bill, so my phone was quickly canceled. I got another phone when I was 15 after I got a job. Story 158. I believe that for many people, their first mobile phone is one that their parents do not use. Story 159. I was 13, and it was one of those Nokia phones with a physical keyboard. Not to brag, but I got pretty good at Snake. Story 160. At 16, it cost $1 a minute back then. I'm old as dirt. Story 161. I was 17 in the year 2000. Times were different back then. The Nokia 5110 was an excellent small phone. Story 162. I was about 14. I was supposed to wait until my 15th birthday like my sister, but she forgot to pick me up from school, and my parents were really mad. So I got my phone early so I could call someone if I were forgotten again. Story 163. I got a third-generation iPhone when I was 9. Being autistic, I did not know how to use it until I got an iPhone 4 when I was 11. Story 164. It was topped up with £5 and was for emergency calls only on my walk to and from school. Story 165. I think I was 15 or 16. At the time I was angry with my parents, but now I understand why. I am deeply grateful to them for that. Story 166. I got one when I was 9. but it wasn't a smartphone. It was a little $30 device that I received because I walked to school alone and my mother wanted me to be able to call her or the police in an emergency. Its only functions were calling and texting. Story 167. I got it when I was 9 years old in September 1999. It was yellow and had an antenna. Story 168. At 7 I had a Nokia brick because my parents wanted to be able to contact me during after-school activities. I think I got my first smartphone around 13. Story 169. I was 24, back in the mid-90s. I had moved abroad for work, and my contract was longer than my visa. Story 170. I was about 12. I had to save for a long time to buy it. It was a cheap, basic phone. I remember my school panicking when they found out. They had never dealt with a child who had a phone before. Story 171. I was 14 and about to turn 15 when I graduated from middle school. It was not a smartphone, but it did have a slide-out keyboard. Story 172. I was about 6 or 7 with my trusty old Nokia phone, and when I was around 8 or 9 my parents got me a proper smartphone. Story 173. I am 19 and I still do not have my own cell phone. I just use everyone else's cell phones around the house. I am going to buy one, but I do not know which is better, Google Pixel, iPhone, Samsung, or OnePlus. Story 174. I was in my late 30s. I do not remember exactly how old, but I was almost 40. Story 175. When I was 14, the rule was no bike until high school, but I bought a 50 cubic centimeter bike and started going out with friends. After coming home late 2 nights in a row, my parents got me a free phone so they could know where I was. Story 176. I got my sister's old phone when I was about 10 or 11. I could not call or text with it, so it was more a play phone than anything else. At 12, I got my first real phone because that is when I started secondary school and my new school was 8 to 10 kilometers away by bike. Story 177. To date myself, I got a pager before cell phones were common. Back then, phones were kept in a bag or were as big and heavy as a brick. Story 178. I was 18 in 2007, when most phones only had very low-quality cameras and no video recording capability. I got the phone because I had a part-time job after school and needed a way to call my mom when it was time to pick me up from the train station. I did not use it much aside from that and talking to my grandpa, who also had a cell phone. Laughing out loud. Story 179. I won't tell you my age, but the year was 1994, and it was a Motorola I purchased from an American telephone and telegraph store. Story 180. I was 10 or 11. My dad won it at a market by guessing the exact tire pressure of a go-kart tire. He did not think he would win, so he put my name in. This was in 2000 or 2001. It was a Motorola V2288 with a screw-on antenna. I still have it. I am very autistic, so I remember every phone I had after that one. Motorola C200, Siemens A62, Samsung SGH X640, Sony K850i, which stopped working after I accidentally took it swimming in Egypt in 2010, Nokia N8, Samsung Galaxy 3 Mini, OnePlus One, iPhone 6, back to OnePlus One, OnePlus X, OnePlus 6, OnePlus Nord 2T 5th generation, and currently a Samsung Galaxy S25. Story 181. I got one in 5th grade to communicate with my parents. They stopped monitoring it in 8th grade. Story 182. At age 13, I was in middle school. My phone then was a Kyocera TNT. My first smartphone came at age 15, a Samsung Galaxy S3. I have low vision, and the accessibility features helped me. Story 183. I think I was 12, mainly to be part of the WhatsApp school group chat. Story 184. I was 18 and texting did not exist back then. Phone calls cost $2 per minute, so if you wanted to communicate you had to make it quick and it had better be important. Story 185. My first device was around age 7. A Kindle or an iPad. Then, around age 9, I had an iPhone 4. Story 186. I was about 13 or 14. Cell phones were just becoming mainstream. I remember all the phones I had then, but only some of their brands and models. My first phone was a cheap brick-style model with exchangeable frames. It was not a Nokia. My parents thought that was too expensive. A couple of years later, I received a Nippon Electric Company N343i4. My birthday. It looks so tiny now. I remember it being bigger. It was followed by a slide phone where I set an opening and closing sound, and then by a phone with an integrated QWERTY keyboard. The first smartphone I owned I received from my brother, who had used it for a couple of years. I think it was a Samsung. Since then, my phones have almost always been Samsung. Story 187. Late in the year 2000, I was already in my forever career, but cell phones had finally become reasonably priced for limited purposes. Story 188. I was 11. It was a flip phone. I got in trouble for sending one text message. Story 189. I vaguely remember being given a super cheap phone when I was 12 or 13, like the kind drug dealers use as a burner phone. Story 190. I think we had moved to the middle of nowhere and both parents worked, so we needed a way to get a hold of each other in an emergency. This was in 2010 when it felt like smartphones were really starting to take off. Story 191. I was 14, and it was a hand-me-down phone from my sister. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.